The rain did not merely fall. It possessed the Choi mansion, pressing against the towering glass walls like restless spirits seeking a warmth they were forever denied. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the heavy, stagnant silence of 30 years of obedience. Ruth Turner moved through the quiet corridors as she always had, a shadow among shadows. Her life measured out in the crisp folds of linen and the rhythmic ticking of clocks that governed a kingdom not built on mercy. She had watched the seasons bleed into years, seeing the boy Hyun-soo shed his timid skin to become a master whose heart was a fortress of cold mathematics. Yet, as she polished the silver, Ruth carried a wound that no amount of industry could stitch closed. The memory of a daughter snatched away to decades ago. A ghost she could only reach through the crackling distance of a telephone wire. Then, the iron gates groaned, a sound that fractured the mansion's artificial peace. A black car slid through the downpour like a quiet declaration of war. When the door opened, Naomi Turner stepped out, and the very atmosphere of the estate seemed to recoil. She did not arrive with the hunched shoulders of a supplicant or the downcast eyes of a maid's child. She moved with the ease of a woman who had walked through fires and come out tempered. Beauty clung to her like a second skin, but it was her boldness, unapologetic and sharp, that unsettled the heavy silence Ruth had spent half a lifetime maintaining. As mother and daughter collapsed into an embrace that sought to bridge 20 years of absence, the world narrowed to the salt of tears and the damp fabric of coats. But above them, standing on the balcony like a dark god carved from obsidian, Hyun-soo Choi watched. He looked down at the reunion, and for the first time in a decade, the gears of his calculated empire ground to a halt. Something ancient and predatory stirred in the hollow of his chest. Naomi felt the weight of his stare. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin and met his gaze with a calm defiance that lacked even a tremor of the fear he commanded from the rest of the world. Most people saw an empire when they looked at Hyun-soo Choi. Naomi looked at him and saw only a man. In that locking of eyes, the mathematics of power were irrevocably compromised, and the master of the house found himself suddenly, dangerously obsessed with the one woman who refused to tremble in his shadow. The reunion was a thing of salt and stuttered breath, a desperate mending of a tapestry torn by 2 decades of silence. Ruth Turner, whose hands had grown callous serving the lineage of another, felt the sudden, vibrant weight of her own flesh and blood pressing against her uniform. In that embrace, the 30 years she had spent walking the quiet corridors of the Choi Empire seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw biological ache of a mother finding her lost cub. Naomi smelled of the world outside, of rain, of independence, and of a life lived far beyond the iron gates that had kept Ruth a dignified prisoner. "You have grown, my daughter," Ruth whispered, her voice a fragile thing that threatened to break beneath the weight of 20 years of absence. Naomi pulled back just enough to frame her mother's face, her own expression a study in unapologetic boldness. There was no shame in her eyes for her mother's apron, only a sharp, clear love that unsettled the very air of the mansion. The guards, hardened by the cold language of power, turned their heads, momentarily ashamed by a display of loyalty that owed nothing to the mathematics of wealth. High above, shielded by the tinted glass of the balcony, Hyun-soo Choi stood as a silent witness. He should have turned away. He should have returned to the ledger of his kingdom, to the cold mathematics of his impending engagement. But his feet remained rooted. He watched the way Naomi laughed, a sound of fearless light that seemed to bleach the shadows from the stone walls. He noticed the way she stood, her spine unbowed, as if she were the sovereign and the mansion merely her backdrop. A strange, dangerous heat began to rise in his chest, an ancient stirring that defied the ruthless training of his father. For 30 years, he had been the master of his own mind, a man of iron and calculation. Yet, as he watched the maid's daughter, he realized with a jolt of alarm that his thoughts were no longer his own. They had been hijacked by the curve of a stranger's smile and the calm defiance of a gaze that had dared to look at him and see only a man. He was the heir to an empire, promised to a woman of his own rank. But in the silence of the balcony, the Korean boss felt the first tremors of an obsession that threatened to force everything and everyone out of his life. The afternoon sun was a pale, clinical thing that failed to penetrate the thick glass of the private study, where the air smelled of imported leather and the cold language of power. Hyun-soo sat across from his fiancée, Jia, a woman whose beauty was as curated and sterile as the diamond on her finger, a stone chosen not for its light, but for its cold mathematics. They did not speak of the stubborn fire of the heart. Instead, they traded words like currency, discussing the kingdom built on power that their union would solidify. Jia spoke of mergers and the consolidation of the underworld's elite with a voice that had never known the fearless laughter that had haunted Hyun-soo since the morning Hyun-soo watched her lips move. Yet his mind was a quiet conspirator, slipping away from the spreadsheets and the talk of loyalty that was really just a debt. He found himself comparing the rehearsed elegance of the woman before him to the sharp, clear, unapologetic boldness of the maid's daughter who had arrived in the rain. While Jia calculated the trajectory of their shared empire, Hyun-soo felt a sudden, suffocating irritation at the mathematics of his own existence. He was an heir to a kingdom not built on mercy, but for the first time, the crown felt like a leaden weight designed to keep him timid beneath his father's shadow. "You aren't listening," Hyun-soo, Jia remarked, her eyes narrowing as she sensed a crack in his ruthless master persona. He looked at her, and for a fleeting, dangerous moment, he wanted to force his fiancée out of the room, to shatter the quiet that had become his prison. The ancient stirring in his chest was no longer a whisper. It was a demand for something that could not be found in a contract. He realized then that he was obsessed not with the power Jia offered, but with the woman who had dared to look at him without fear. As he stood to conclude the meeting, the stubborn fire of his obsession began to burn through the cold logic of his life, signaling a scandal that would shake the underworld itself. The cold mathematics of the boardroom could not extinguish the stubborn fire that now licked at the edges of Hyun-soo's composure. Driven by a hunger he could not name, he descended from the ivory towers of the mansion into the belly of the house, the servants' quarters, a world governed by the quiet corridors of Ruth's 30-year reign. He moved under the thin guise of an inspection, a ruthless master checking the mortar of his fortress. But his ears were tuned only for a frequency that unsettled the mansion's silence. As he neared the heavy oak door of the staff dining room, the sterile air of the upper floors was replaced by the scent of steam, ginger, and garlic, the honest smells of a life lived without the cold language of power. And then he heard it, a sound that shattered the hardened stillness of his world. It was Naomi's fearless laughter, a vibrant, melodic eruption that treated the Choi Empire as though it were simply a man, not a kingdom of shadows. He pushed the door open. The laughter died in the throats of the other maids, who instinctively lowered their heads, falling back into the timid patterns of their station. Only Naomi remained unbowed. She sat at the scarred wooden table, a bowl of rice before her, her sharp, clear, unapologetic gaze meeting his without a flicker of the fear that usually trailed in his wake. Ruth stood quickly, her steady hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron, a mother sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Is there a problem with the quarters, Mr. Choi?" Naomi asked, her voice carrying the ease of someone unafraid of powerful men. She did not stand. She did not tremble. She looked at the mafia boss and saw the boy who had grown up beneath a father's shadow, and in that look, Hyun-soo felt his ruthless persona stripping away like dry husks. He had come to assert his dominance, yet he stood there, an heir to a kingdom paralyzed by the calm defiance of a woman who owned nothing but her spirit. The ancient stirring in his chest grew into a roar. He realized that his obsession was no longer a secret he kept from himself, but a stubborn fire that was beginning to consume the very foundations of his empire. The stubborn fire of obsession is a restless guest, and it drove Hyun-soo to wander the upper galleries of the Choi mansion, where the cold language of power was etched into every marble pillar. He found her there, in the restricted West Wing, a place of whispers of loyalty where his father's old ledgers and the cold mathematics of the underworld were kept under lock and key. Naomi was standing by the tall glass walls, her silhouette a sharp, clear, unapologetic break against the glittering indifference of the city skyline. She did not belong in this sanctuary of secrets, yet she stood with the ease of someone unafraid of powerful men, her presence unsettling the mansion's long-guarded silence. Hyun-soo's shadow fell across her, long and hardened, the mark of a ruthless master who had grown up timid beneath his father's shadow. Any other soul caught in this restricted area would have collapsed into a sob story or offered a reason built on lies. But Naomi did not move to hide. She did not lower her head. Instead, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze without hesitation, her expression a calm defiance that made the air between them thick with the scent of an approaching storm. "You are in a place where even the walls have ears, Naomi Turner," he said, his voice a low vibration of the ancient stirring in his chest. "What does a maid's daughter seek among the bones of an empire?" Naomi did not apologize. She did not tremble. Instead, she let out a short, fearless breath of a laugh that seemed to mock the kingdom not built on mercy. "I seek to understand how a man can live in such a ruthless kingdom and call it a home," she replied, her words cutting through the cold mathematics of his status. "You build these walls to keep the world out, but you have only succeeded in locking yourself in. Is this what you want? To be a mafia boss feared by all but loved by none, governed by cold mathematics instead of a heart?" The audacity of her question unsettled the mansion's silence more than her presence ever could. Hyun-soo felt his ruthless armor cracking. She spoke to him as though he were simply a man, not an empire, and for a dangerous moment, he found he had no answer. He was obsessed with her because she was the only woman who dared look at him without fear, and as they stood in the quiet corridors of his power, he realized that the stubborn fire she had ignited was beginning to burn away the very foundations of his father's house. The scent of expensive, synthetic jasmine preceded Jia into the hallway, a fragrance that did not belong to the restless spirits of the rain or the honest steam of the kitchen. She arrived not as a guest, but as a surveyor of a kingdom built on power, her heels clicking against the marble with the cold mathematics of someone who owned the very air she breathed. Beside her, Ruth Turner stood with steady hands clasped, her head bowed in the practiced humility of 30 years, a woman who had become, in the eyes of the elite, a mere fixture of the quiet corridors. Jia did not look at Ruth. She stripped off her damp silk gloves and tossed them toward the older woman's chest without breaking her stride, treating the mother of the house as if she were a coat hook carved from wood. "The tea is lukewarm, and the dust in the foyer is offensive," Jia remarked, her voice carrying the cold language of power that sought to diminish everything it touched. Naomi, standing in the shadow of a heavy pillar, felt the ancient stirring of a different fire. She stepped into the light, her sharp, clear, unapologetic boldness cutting through the suffocating silence Jia had imposed. She caught the gloves before they could soil her mother's uniform, her defiant gaze locking onto the fiancée with the ease of someone unafraid of powerful men. "My mother is the memory of this house, not its footstool," Naomi said, her voice a calm vibration that unsettled the mansion's silence. The audacity of the remark caused Jia to stop, her eyes narrowing as she faced a maid's daughter who refused to acknowledge the mathematics of their rank. Jia looked at Naomi's beauty clinging to her like light and felt a sudden, sharp pang of insecurity. "You must be the girl from the telephone voices," Jia sneered, attempting to re-establish the ruthless hierarchy. "A pity you returned only to learn that boldness in a servant is merely a lack of education." Naomi did not flinch. She did not lower her head. Instead, she stepped closer, her calm defiance a shield for her mother. "And a pity you have spent so much on your education only to forget how to be a human being," Naomi countered, her fearless laughter bubbling just beneath the surface. From the balcony above, Hyun-soo watched the stubborn fire of the two women clashing. He saw his fiancée's shadow lengthening, but his obsession was rooted firmly in the woman who stood her ground, the only one who dared to challenge his ruthless kingdom. The air in the grand library was thick with the cold language of power, a sanctuary where the mathematics of the underworld were calculated in hushed tones, and the smoke of expensive cigars. Hyun-soo Choi sat at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by men whose whispers of loyalty were often just veils for their own greed. They spoke of project funds, of voting rights, and of the nominee agreements that held their fragile empire together. As the ruthless master of the house, Hyun-soo was expected to navigate these clandestine waters with the same hardened indifference his father had perfected, yet the stubborn fire of his obsession had made him a quiet conspirator against his own focus. While a lieutenant detailed the embezzlement of a rival's assets, Hyun-soo's ears were tuned to the quiet corridors beyond the heavy oak doors. And then it drifted in the sound of Naomi's voice, a sharp, clear, unapologetic melody that unsettled the mansion's silence. She was speaking to her mother, her fearless laughter bubbling through the cracks of the ruthless kingdom like water through parched earth. For a dangerous moment, the mafia boss wavered. The cold mathematics of the meeting became a dull hum, replaced by the ancient stirring in his chest that demanded he abandon this kingdom not built on mercy to find the woman who looked at him without fear. He watched a fly circle the crystal decanter, his mind tracing the path of Naomi's boldness instead of the enterprise contracts spread before him. Mr. Choi, your signature is required on the notarized documentation, the lieutenant prompted, his voice breaking the spell. Hyun-soo blinked, his ruthless mask sliding back into place, though it felt heavier than before. He signed the papers with a hardened hand, but his spirit remained in the hallway, tethered to the maid's daughter. He realized then that he was no longer timid beneath his father's shadow, but he was being mastered by a different power, one that made the mathematics of power seem like the truth slipping away. As the meeting concluded, the city glittered indifferent, sleepless, unaware that the ruthless Korean boss was already half consumed by a fire that would soon force his fiancée out and shake the very foundations of his world. The sky above the city finally surrendered, the rain transforming into a storm that raged on, battering the tall glass walls until the world beyond was nothing but a gray, sleepless blur. Inside the library, the unsettling silence was broken only by the low rumble of thunder, a sound that usually commanded the timid to retreat. Hyun-soo stood by the mahogany shelves, his hardened silhouette cast long by the flickering lamps, when he realized he was not alone. Naomi was there, trapped by the pouring rain outside, her presence a quiet declaration that the mathematics of power had no authority over nature. The mafia boss turned, his gaze without mercy, expecting to find the trembling or lowering of the head that usually followed his shadow. Instead, he found Naomi leaning against a stack of leather-bound volumes, her beauty clinging to her like light in the dimness. She looked at the ruthless master and did not flinch when the thunder shook the floorboards. She merely watched him with a calm defiance that unsettled the mansion's silence more than the storm ever could. "Are you not afraid of the dark, Naomi Turner?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of the ancient stirring in his chest. He remembered the sadness of his own childhood, how he had been scared of the dark and the thunder while growing up in his father's shadow. He expected her to admit to a sob story, to show the vulnerability that would allow him to maintain his ruthless control. "I am afraid of many things, Mr. Choi," she replied, her fearless laughter replaced by a sharp, clear sobriety. "But I am not afraid of a man who hides behind cold mathematics and whispers of loyalty to keep from being seen." She stepped toward him, her unapologetic boldness bridging the distance between the mafia boss and the maid's daughter. "Most people fear you because they see your empire, I see a man who is obsessed with a life he is too afraid to claim. In that moment, as the lightning illuminated the quiet corridors of his soul, Hyun-soo realized the truth slipping away from his grasp. She was the only woman who dared look at him without fear, the only one who saw him as simply a man, not a kingdom not built on mercy. The stubborn fire of his obsession was no longer a secret. It was a dangerous reality that threatened to force his fiancée out and burn his ruthless kingdom to the ground. The cold mathematics that had once governed Hyun-soo's life began to fracture, replaced by a stubborn fire that left his senior lieutenants whispering in the quiet corridors of the Choi estate. He was the heir to a kingdom not built on mercy, yet he now moved with the distracted air of a man haunted by fearless laughter. During a critical briefing on the port renovation project, he did not demand the notarized documentation or inquire about voting rights. Instead, he stared at the tall glass walls, watching the rain press itself against the glass while his mind replayed Naomi's calm defiance. When the enterprise contracts for his merger with Ji-us family were presented, Hyun-soo did not sign them with his usual hardened precision. He found bad news in every clause, raising dangerous objections that unsettled the mansion's silence and stalled the mathematics of power. His lieutenants, men who had served his father's ruthless kingdom for decades, exchanged looks of helpless loneliness, unable to comprehend why their mafia boss was sabotaging the very union that would secure their future. To them, it was the truth slipping away. To Hyun-soo, it was the first quiet declaration of his own freedom. Mr. Choi, this delay is unworthy of your reputation, his advisor prompted, his voice carrying the cold language of power. But Hyun-soo's focus was no longer his own. He was obsessed with the memory of Naomi standing in the library, the only woman who dared look at him without fear. He began to shut down all business operations linked to Ji-us interests, an act of unapologetic boldness that shook the underworld itself. He knew the price of obsession was high. It would likely lead to a scandal and ruin his reputation, but he no longer cared for a kingdom that required him to hide in his father's shadow. As he walked past Ruth Turner in the hallway, he did not see a fixture or a maid, but the mother of the woman who had made him simply a man. The ancient stirring in his chest was now a roar, and as the city glittered indifferent, sleepless, Hyun-soo prepared to force his fiancée out of his life forever, regardless of the suffering he's endured or the debts he supposedly owed to tradition. The cold mathematics of the boardroom could not quiet the ancient stirring that now compelled Hyun-soo to seek out the source of the stubborn fire. He found Ruth Turner in the small, sun-bleached laundry room, her steady hands moving with a rhythm that had survived 30 years of servitude in a kingdom not built on mercy. As he approached, the unsettling silence of the mansion seemed to weigh heavier upon her shoulders, the quiet corridors having witnessed her suffering for decades. She did not lower her head in the usual way. Instead, she looked at him with a gaze that held the sadness of 1,000 sleepless nights. You look at my daughter and see a pretty face or a plaything. Mr. Choi, Ruth began, her voice a low vibration that cut through his hardened exterior. But you do not see the wound time could not stitch. You do not know why she was forced away from this house when you were both still children timid beneath your father's shadow. Hyun-soo remained silent, the ruthless master persona momentarily slipping to reveal the boy who had once shared childhood memories in the attic. Ruth's hand slowed as she spoke of the departing husband and the cold mathematics of power that had demanded Naomi be taken away as a pawn in a debt she did not owe. She described the tragic day the iron gates had closed, separating mother and child for 20 years of absence, leaving only distant voices over the telephone to bridge the endless longing. She was abandoned by the men who claimed to love her, just as your mother was conspired against, Ruth said. Her words a quiet declaration that shook the underworld of Hyun-soo's conscience. She did not return to ruin your life, but to find the only light she remembered in this ruthless kingdom. The revelation hit Hyun-soo with the force of a storm that raged on. He saw, for the first time, the scars that Naomi carried beneath her unapologetic boldness. She wasn't just a maid's daughter or a freeloader. She was a victim of the same cold language of power that had hardened him into a mafia boss. His obsession was no longer just a stubborn fire of the flesh. It was a desperate need to protect the woman who had survived the suffering he's endured. As he left the room, the mathematics of power felt unworthy of his attention, and his resolve to force his fiancée out and sever all personal ties to his father's legacy became an iron truth. The Choi mansion transformed into a gala of spirits, a glittering cage of cold mathematics where the city's elite gathered to toast to a kingdom built on power. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, the air was heavy with the cold language of power and the whispers of loyalty that bound these high-born families together. Gia, draped in silks that cost more than a maid's lifetime of labor, moved through the crowd with the ease of someone unafraid, her presence a quiet declaration of her impending sovereignty. To assert her ruthless dominance, she had orchestrated a dangerous humiliation. Naomi was forced to trade her unapologetic boldness for a server's tray. Moving among the guests as a pretty face stripped of her prestigious status, Hyun-soo stood on the periphery. A mafia boss trapped in a tuxedo that felt like a hardened suit of armor. His focus was no longer his own. It followed the sharp, clear silhouette of Naomi as she navigated the quiet corridors of the ballroom. Every time she offered a flute of champagne to a man who looked at her as a plaything, Hyun-soo felt the ancient stirring in his chest reach a fever pitch. He watched Ji-ah summon Naomi with a flick of a hardened finger, a gesture meant to remind everyone that the maid's daughter was nothing more than a servant under her roof. "The tray is heavy, isn't it, Naomi?" Ji-ah remarked, her voice a low vibration of malice that unsettled the mansion's silence. "Perhaps if you had stayed forced away in the world beyond the gates, you wouldn't have to lower your head now." She laughed, a sound that lacked the fearless warmth of Naomi's own, and reached out to deliberately tip a glass, sending a dark stain across Naomi's white cuff. The room went still, the mathematics of power hanging in the balance. Naomi did not offer a sob story, nor did she lower her head. She met Ji-ah's gaze with a calm defiance that made the ruthless master on the balcony grip the marble railing until his knuckles turned white. "A stain on cloth can be washed, Miss Ji-ah," Naomi replied, her voice sharp and clear, enough to reach Hyun-soo's ears. "But a stain on the soul is a wound time could not stitch." Hyun-soo saw the stubborn fire in Naomi's eyes and realized he could no longer stay timid beneath his father's shadow. The tension had reached a dangerous peak. A scandal that would shake the underworld was only a heartbeat away. He began to descend the stairs, his ruthless persona cracking, ready to force his fiancée out of his life and claim the only woman who dared look at him without fear. The gala of spirits held its breath, the air thick with the cold language of power as Ji-ah prepared her final, ruthless stroke. She stood at the center of the ballroom, her hardened gaze fixed on Naomi, who remained standing with calm defiance despite the dark stain on her cuff. The mathematics of power demanded a sacrifice, and Ji-ah intended for it to be the dignity of the maid's daughter. "It is truly a scandal how some things never change," Ji-ah declared, her voice ringing out through the quiet corridors of the hall to ensure the city's elite heard every syllable. "You return with such unapologetic boldness, Naomi Turner, yet you forget that you are merely the pretty face of a woman who has spent 30 years scrubbing the dust in the foyer of this very house." She gestured vaguely toward the kitchens, where Ruth Turner worked in helpless loneliness. "A servant's blood always finds its level. No matter how you dress, you will always be a plaything of the underworld." Born from the cold mathematics of a woman who knows only how to bow, the insult unsettled the mansion's silence like a physical blow. A ripple of whispers of loyalty and cruel amusement ran through the guests, who looked at Naomi as if she were a piece of property. But Naomi did not lower her head. She stood her ground, her beauty clinging to her like light even as the wound time could not stitch was laid bare for all to see. Above them, the ancient stirring in Hyun-soo's chest finally became an explosion. He descended the stairs not as the timid boy beneath his father's shadow, but as a mafia boss whose obsession had turned into a stubborn fire. He did not look at the notarized documentation of his status. He looked only at the woman who dared look at him without fear. Enough. Hyun-soo's voice was a low vibration that shattered the cold mathematics of the evening. He stepped between Naomi and his fiancée, his hardened silhouette casting a long shadow over Jia. You speak of station and servants, Jia, yet you are the one who is unworthy of this house. He turned to Naomi, his focus no longer his own, and in front of the sleepless eyes of the underworld, he took her hand. The ruthless Korean boss had finally reached the dangerous breaking point, and as he prepared to force his fiancée out, the city began to whisper of a scandal that would shake the underworld itself. The silence that followed Hyun-soo's intervention was not the respectful hush of an audience, but the jagged, breathless stillness of an empire witnessing its own collapse. Jia stood frozen, her face a mask of hardened disbelief as she looked at the hand of the mafia boss firmly entwined with that of the maid's daughter. The cold mathematics of her world, the mergers, the bloodlines, the strategic whispers of loyalty had been rendered obsolete by a single, unapologetic gesture of human warmth. You would humiliate me for her? Jia hissed, her voice trembling with a ruthless fury that unsettled the mansion's silence. You would throw away the kingdom built on power for a girl who possesses nothing but a pretty face and a mother who cleans my silk. Hyun-soo did not flinch. He did not return to the timid shadow of his father's legacy. He looked out at the city's elite, the sleepless watchers who lived by the cold language of power, and made his quiet declaration. I am not throwing away a kingdom, he said, his voice a low vibration that carried to every corner of the gala of spirits. I am burning a tomb. The mathematics of power that brought us together is a dead language, and I will no longer speak it. He turned his gaze back to Jia, his expression without mercy yet strangely at peace. This engagement was a contract of cold mathematics, but obsession is a stubborn fire that does not recognize your ledgers. You have insulted the woman who is the memory of this house, and the daughter who is its soul. You are no longer welcome beneath this roof. The great expulsion was absolute. In front of the indifferent, glittering city, the ruthless Korean boss forced his fiancée out, signaling a scandal that would shake the underworld itself. Jia was escorted toward the iron gates by the very guards who had once bowed to her, leaving behind a ruthless kingdom that had suddenly become simply a man and a woman standing without fear. Naomi felt the heat of his palm against hers, the ancient stirring in his chest now a steady, grounding pulse. The mathematics were gone, replaced by a dangerous and beautiful reality. As the storm finally broke outside, Hyun-soo looked at the maid's daughter, the only woman who dared look at him without fear, and realized that his obsession had finally set him free. The scandal that shook the underworld traveled faster than the rain slicking the city streets, carrying the news that the ruthless Korean boss had traded a political dynasty for the maid's daughter. In the dark, smoke-filled clubs where whispers of loyalty were usually bought with cold mathematics, the betrayal was seen as a dangerous weakness. The mathematics of power did not allow for a heart that functioned outside the ledger, and by morning, the clandestine forces of his father's old allies were already moving to ruin his reputation and seize the kingdom built on power. Hyun-soo stood in the grand library, the silence of the mansion now heavy with the threat of a coup. His lieutenants, men who had known him since he was timid beneath his father's shadow, looked at him with helpless loneliness, their voting rights and nominee agreements now feeling like the truth slipping away. They brought news of shutdown operations and embezzlement charges fabricated by Jia's family, a debt repayment for the public humiliation at the gala. The mafia boss felt the walls of his ruthless kingdom closing in. the cold language of power now being used to write his professional obituary. It was then that Naomi entered, her unapologetic boldness a sharp, clear contrast to the gloom of the quiet corridors. She did not come with a sob story or a plea for mercy. She walked past the hardened men of the underworld with the ease of someone unafraid, placing a hand on Hyun-soo's shoulder, a touch that carried the weight of 20 years of absence. Finally resolved, they think they can starve you of your empire because they do not understand that you have already found your soul, she said, her voice a low vibration that unsettled the mansion's silence. She looked at the gathered lieutenants with a calm defiance that made them lower their heads in involuntary respect. You are not a plaything of their cold mathematics, Hyun-soo. You are a man who has forced his fiancée out to claim his own truth. If they want a war over the mathematics of power, let them have it. They have the numbers, but you have the only woman who dares look at you without fear. Single quotes, double quotes. In her unapologetic support, Hyun-soo found a strength that his father's shadow had never provided. The ancient stirring in his chest was no longer an obsession of the dark, but a stubborn fire that lit the way forward. He realized that while the city glittered indifferent, sleepless, he was no longer alone in his ruthless kingdom. The scandal was merely the beginning of his transformation. He would face the coup not as a mafia boss protecting a pretty face, but as a man protecting his life. The battle for the Choi Empire was not won with the cold mathematics of the old guard, but with the stubborn fire of a man who had finally outgrown his father's shadow. Hyun-soo Choi stood in the center of the grand hall, no longer timid or hardened by the cold language of power, but possessed of a sharp, clear clarity that unsettled the mansion's silence. The coup attempted by Ji-eo's family and the disgruntled lieutenants crumbled not because of nominee agreements or voting rights, but because Hyun-soo had dismantled the very mathematics they used to calculate their greed. He had shut down all business operations that relied on the whispers of loyalty of the past, rebuilding his kingdom on a foundation of unapologetic boldness. Beside him stood Naomi Turner, the maid's daughter who had become the sovereign of his heart. She did not stand behind him like a pretty face or a plaything, but beside him, her beauty clinging to her like light and her gaze a calm defiance that refused to lower her head to the underworld. Together, they had navigated the scandal that shook the underworld itself, proving that a ruthless boss could find more strength in fearless laughter than in notarized documentation. Ruth Turner watched them from the quiet corridors, her steady hands finally at rest. The wound time could not stitch had been healed not by the mathematics of power, but by the ancient stirring of a love that recognized no station. Her daughter was no longer forced away, and the boy she had watched grow up was no longer a prisoner of his prestigious status. The iron gates of the mansion remained, but they were no longer a barrier to the world beyond. They were merely the entrance to a home where loyalty was a precious thing worth fighting for. As the city glittered indifferent, sleepless, Hyun-soo looked at Naomi and realized that he was finally simply a man, free from the cold language of his ancestors. He had forced his fiancée out and severed all personal ties to a life built on debt repayment and sin. In the quiet corridors where restless spirits once wandered, there was now only the fearless pulse of a life lived without fear. The ruthless Korean boss had secured his empire on his own terms, standing tall beside the only woman who dared look at him and see the soul beneath the empire.